The old nail had always bothered her, stuck fast in the wall next to the front door of her small apartment. It must have been there for generations of tenants. Nobody had been able to get it out, it seems. They'd just painted over it. Over the weekend, she'd found a small vintage mirror at the flea market, and now the nail at least had a purpose. The mirror hung a little low, but it was still an improvement. Alisha stooped and checked her hair and makeup in the old mirror, then left for the day. That evening, as she sat watching TV, she heard faint voices raised in argument. She didn't remember ever hearing the neighbours fight before. She tried to ignore it, but it sounded serious. She followed the sound out to the hallway. The muffled voices seemed to be coming through the wall from the corridor outside. She put her ear to the front door, her hand on the doorknob, but if anything, the voices were even more muffled and strangely distant. She carefully opened the front door and looked out through the narrow crack, but the hallway was empty. The voices, or the shouting, continued. She heard what sounded like something being pushed hard against a wall. Then everything was quiet. After a moment, she went back to the TV. It happened again the following night, in the early hours of the morning, as she lay half awake in bed, her tired brain still focused on a problem at work. She heard the sound of a distant door slamming, then an angry male voice. She rolled onto her back and looked up at the ceiling, at the grey-blue moonlight that crept in through the window. The voices seemed clearer this time. Perhaps it was the late hour, with the city outside quiet and asleep. She pulled back the covers and sat on the edge of the bed, listening as the argument unfolded. Odd words and snatches of sentences was all she could hear, nothing to make clear what the argument was about. She stood and made her way out of the bedroom and through the living room to the dark hallway and reached for the light switch, but stopped when she noticed something odd reflected in the small mirror. The light was already on. In the glass, she could see the hallway and the door to the living room. Her hallway, her door, except the door in the mirror was closed and painted green, and the hallway was decorated with pale blue-flowered wallpaper, lit by a single naked bulb that hung on a twisted cloth cord. The voices were there, in the mirror, the arguing, tense, angry voices. She stood in the darkness staring into this other world and realized that she couldn't see herself. This was no reflection. As she watched, scared but fascinated, the voices grew clearer. "I don't care! I don't care!" a woman shouted. "My duty is to God, to Jesus, and I won't have you stand between me and him." She heard a slap and an angry male voice. "You choose Jesus over me. You choose that fucker Jesus over me. Well, he can satisfy me in ways you never could." Another slap and a scream. Alisha grabbed the mirror and lifted it from the nail and stood looking at her reflection, lit by the faint light from the living room. Whatever that was before, whatever she had seen and heard, had gone. She put the mirror on the floor, leaning it against the wall, and then in the living room sat quietly on the sofa staring at the walls, eventually drifting off to sleep. The next day she dragged herself into work, tired, distracted and disturbed, not telling anyone her crazy story. She wanted to get home, to put the mirror back on the nail, to see if it would happen again, to see what would happen, to see if there was more to the story. She cancelled her regular girls' night out. "Not feeling so good," she lied. "Sorry." Sitting on one of the kitchen chairs, she faced the mirror and waited. It didn't take long. At first it was the familiar sound of the front door closing, then the orange glow from the single bare bulb as it was switched on. She stood and watched as a heavy man took off his coat and hat and set them on a hat stand before going through the door into the living room. But the image faded and her reflection returned. She sighed, disappointed, and went into the kitchen. She was making coffee when she heard the familiar raised voices begin again out in the hallway. It was the same as the previous night, the same tone, the same rhythm, and the same words, It was the same argument. She poured the coffee and headed into the hallway. You choose that fucker Jesus over me. He can satisfy me in ways you never could. Oh, go girl, Alisha thought to herself. Again the slap and the scream, then nothing. Alisha walked up to the mirror, the coffee mug in hand. She took a sip and waited. Come on, she said quietly. The green door crashed open, and Alisha instinctively jumped back, the coffee spilling over her hand and onto the floor. In the mirror, the woman rushed into the hallway, almost tripping before she made a grab for the front door, but the man was close behind, and he slammed her into the wall before she could reach it. Where are you going? Alisha heard him hiss. She watched him grab the woman by the upper arms and spin her around. She spat in his face. Bitch! He screamed and punched her in the stomach. The woman collapsed out of sight while the man stood over her, breathing heavily. He turned and went quickly back into the living room, leaving the woman moaning and sobbing on the floor. Fuck me, said Alisha, taking another sip of coffee. The man returned and stood in the doorway. He was holding a hammer and what looked like old rusty nails. You want to be like Jesus, yeah? Then fuck it. He walked over and grabbed the woman by the wrist and pulled her up with such violence that she screamed in agony. Alisha leaned close to see better, but the man used his weight to pin the woman's arm to the wall, her hand blocking the view. Fuck, Alisha said, punching the wall in frustration. I can't see. But at the first blow of the hammer she stood, quiet, fascinated and repulsed, as the nail punched easily through the flesh of the hand and, seemingly, through the mirror itself. Another blow, and the nail moved another half-inch as blood began to seep into the small creases of the skin. It's the nail, Alisha said, passing her finger through the blood-streaked rusty phantom. This is the fucking nail. With each blow the woman cried out, and the hand spasmed as the nail dug deeper through the flesh into the plaster and brick. I bet Jesus didn't fucking scream, spat the man. The hand and smeared blood obscured the view, but Alisha heard the sobs and pleading as the man moved to the other side and began to hammer a second rusty nail into the woman's other hand. When done, the man stepped back admiring his handiwork. He spat in her face before raising the hammer to strike. Alisha pulled the mirror from the wall, the hallway falling instantly dark and silent. She looked at her dim reflection, then put the mirror on the floor with the coffee mug and went to the other side of the door to look for any trace of the other nail. It was easy to find, a small indentation, though she hadn't noticed it before. She felt it with her finger. Jesus, she said. The new mirror arrived after a few days. It was the largest she could find online. She apologized to the driver for having to carry it up 3 flights of stairs. Building's too old for a lift, she explained. No worries, just sign here. She finally got the mirror up, hanging on the old nail on one side and a new one she'd hammered into the indentation on the other. It wasn't level, and it blocked the front door, but she didn't care. She wasn't going anywhere tonight, and nobody was visiting. She turned off the light, sat on the kitchen chair, and, putting the coffee on the floor, she licked her finger and slipped her hand down between her legs and watched as the soft orange light from the bare bulb slowly appeared.